Hello, we're going to do a quick little demo on some of the white lace that you can see on the form from this week. So I'm beginning by underpainting, and I've gone ahead and sketched everything out. I've used a pencil to sort of define what some of my different shapes are, the pattern of the lace, how different parts of it fall, and then I'm paying attention to the like where the fabric lays underneath and it's darker, where sometimes I can see more of the lace kind of bunching up on itself. It becomes more opaque, it's whiter there. But I'm also wanting to just define the color temperature of a couple different areas. So we're putting in yellows where we're getting that amber light reflected from the left-hand side. And we're adding in some like muddier, cooler tones. With blue, a little bit of purple, but a little bit of like grayish added in. It's not too defined. It's not very much of a real color. It's just sort of a bluish, muddy color. I'm using that to just sort of create space. Right now I'm not worrying too much about painting around any of my high white areas because I'm going to use frisket over those. So as soon as I get this sort of laid in, we're gonna let it dry. If it got a little too dark, you can always blot it back out. So it's underpainting, let it dry, and then we're gonna add our frisket. So I've gone ahead and added the frisket to these areas, and I'm able now to start getting some darker tones. So Mia, you showed that from the photo you had that you could definitely see the area where the purple is underlaying the lace a little differently than where up over on the shoulder it stayed kind of brighter white. So I'm positioning my shadows to sort of fall underneath that. Now I used my frisket on all of the more opaque parts of the lace. So the edge of the border, I used it on beading, I used it on the little flowers, and then I made some like soft sort of just shapes and textures, little dots, little things like that to create some of the different textures that are in the lace without being super specific about what they are necessarily. As I'm laying in shadows, I'm referencing the image. I not have a printed out version of it, so I couldn't include it in this demo, but I'm referencing the image and I'm using a combination of some bluer and purpler tones in areas where the actual purple fabric is showing through, and this sort of like muddied gray I'm creating by mixing a blue, a little red, and a little bit of yellow. So that kind of is our like warm shadow, and then the other purple is our darker, cooler shadow. And that just depends on what you're seeing in the reference image, how it turns towards the light. I'm brightening up some of those yellow reflections to help things stay nice and bright. This can start to look a little dark. Remember that when we pull that frisket off, we're going to reveal a lot of white. I've probably got 25 to 40% covered in frisket. So that's going to really change as it comes up. I'm also going to go ahead right now and start laying in a little bit of a shadow for the background just so that we can kind of understand where the edge of that lace is and to create a nice contrast so that the white of the lace has something to like interact with. And because I want to paint some of that color in behind the like transparent level, so that's why I like doing the background at this stage versus waiting and adding it at the end. It would be kind of hard to add it in the underpainting. So I'm going to pull some of those gray tones up into this sheer spot. I'm using a bit of a blotting motion with my brush. Instead of nice smooth strokes, I'm kind of creating texture in everything I do by kind of picking up my brush and dabbing it onto the page instead of doing swooshes of color. That helps create more texture and that illusion of like the net and the different things that are going on. So I have a little tiny brush now. I've let that first layer of shadows dry, and I'm mixing kind of a bluish purple and adding some very small detail work to add more to the texture and to give depth to the specific little pieces. We've pulled up the frisket when it dried, so that's allowing me to kind of go through and start defining kind of the underside of those raised white flowers, the underside of the beads. You can see that the whole thing since lifting the frisket has definitely lightened in value. So now we're creating more contrast and defining like the dimension of each of the little sections. A fine brush like this is really nice. It doesn't travel as far, but it's useful for this kind of section. I made that line a little hard. You can see I then quickly went through and softened it by blotting it with my finger, or you could also use a brush with just a little drier, clean water and then dry it off, and that would be able to soften any edges also. You can also use the point of any of your rounds though. It's just a little easier because you're carrying less water with a thin brush like this. But I do it with my round brush all the time, just using the point. So I'm creating some kind of low contrast texture with blue tones and grayish tones up in there. You can see that I'm mixing my blue with a little bit of an umber to create something a little more neutral. And I'm using those to define the shape and exaggerate sort of the folds of it a little bit. I'm not outlining everything. I'm sort of doing the undersides of things. I'm choosing to think that the light is strongest from the left-hand side, kind of up above, downward pointing. So I'm focusing my shadows more to the bottom right-hand side of things. And I'm making them maybe a little bit more exaggerated than they would be if than they look in the photo, because they're going to dry down and they're going to get lighter as they dry. You can see again that kind of little dotting, little texture approach that I'm using with the brush, just to put in a little bit of added texture. Instead of keeping things nice and smooth, I'm not doing a lot of lines, I'm doing sort of little blots. So here I'm using a gel pen to just start really bringing, especially the little beads that are tiny and round and hard to paint around. This gel pen is great for putting those back in the middle of the flowers. It also by nature has a little bit of a gleam to it compared to the page of a watercolor painting, so it kind of helps with that. I like to define my silhouette, so on that outside edge, bringing some of that more forward, and on the edge where it hits the border at the bottom. I'm also going to use my pencil to just sort of create contrast. Once again, I'm not trying to outline everything or all sides of one thing. I'm kind of choosing a side and adding some dimension. I do tend to circle around softly all my beads because I do think that that little bit of shadow all the way around them is helpful, but around kind of the sides of flowers, you can add some texture with your pencil. I like to do this part last usually because the graphite can be moved, so anything you do after this would pick up that bit of graphite. It could get a little muddy. In this demo, I probably could have waited on doing the graphite pencil and worked. I'm going to do a little bit of white colored pencil, and I should have done that before the graphite pencil because it gets a little smudgy. But you can see how that just like level of contrast and how this helps to bring forward the details of the lace really does start to bring it dimensionality. It starts to make it more specific. I like to use the pencil also, you'll see kind of where that fold is. I brought the pencil lines out of it, so they're kind of blooming out of the shadows sections. So here's where I use that white colored pencil, and truthfully it's a little smudgy because of the graphite pencil first, but the effect still works. So unlike a gel pen, this is a much like softer approach to bringing some sections more white and kind of creating a translucency feeling. So especially at the front edges of folds, I really like using it. And this is the final result. I hope that helps. Have a good one.